Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I am off to my conference in Maryland tomorrow, and I'm just walloped by a sinus infection, which you can probably hear, so this ought to make for a fun challenge. I'm just starting to feel like the conference is coming together, and might not be a total humiliation for me, but there's still time for anxiety to rear its ugly head. There are a lot of moving parts to this conference meeting thing, and I'm in charge of the whole shebang because I'm a one-man show, and I got to trust the hotel and the AV guys and the restaurant and all the speakers who are presenting and the attendees, and it leaves me pretty wrecked every year. And as I've gotten across over the years, I'm not exactly good about trusting people, but, this is what I have to do. Last year went flawlessly. I like to hope this one is going to go by perfectly smoothly and no one will notice me collapse at the end of Friday, but we'll see. On the plus side, the printer finished the attendee badges, posters, and conference guides, so I could pick up all that stuff today and not have to do it tomorrow morning before a 250-mile drive to the hotel. On the downside, one of my speakers told me on Monday that he has a family emergency and can no longer present on Thursday, and it is a big, legit family emergency, but he can still do Friday. So I had to flip him with one of the Friday speakers, move another one slot so he could get in early that day and then get back out. And now the conference guides that I just mentioned and two of the posters that have the big conference agenda on them are out of date, but all this stuff always happens right after you go to print, The other downside of all this is that I have been so harried and run down that I do not have a guest scheduled for next week's show, so things might be dark, or you might get subjected to another interminable monologue episode. I don't think I have enough trauma or weird reverie or anything to dole out anything like that in a hurry, but you never know. Anyway, that's all in the future. We got a conversation to share, so let's get cracking. My guest this week is Stephen B. Shepard, or Steve. He has a wonderful new book out now, Salinger's Soul, His Personal and Religious Odyssey. It's from Post Hill Press. Salinger's Soul explores J.D. Salinger through his biography and his writing and writing about him. It's a brief book, around 200 pages, but Steve manages to go deep on Salinger's life and what it meant to leave it all behind, to go into seclusion, but not as ardent a level of seclusion as we all think of, and where his soul went. Now, Steve's love for Salinger's fiction is evident throughout the book, as is the depth of his deep reading research into this. And he synthesizes a lot of, facts, stories, rumors, chronology, all to put together Salinger's soul. And at the same time, he's doing something greater than that. He's not just recounting biography, but he's trying to find this elusive core, this missing self at the center of it all. When Ron Rosenbaum did his Salinger profile in the late 90s, he kind of worked around the notion of the sound of one hand clapping. And that's what any writing that tries to get at Salinger ultimately has to reckon with, I guess. And I think, and it comes up in the book and this conversation, that maybe Salinger's seclusion, the writer who stops publishing but maybe keeps writing all along. Maybe that notion speaks to all of us today in this time where we're all posting content and leveraging our brands and trying to push ourselves out into this public sphere. And this was somebody who began to reach significant fame and acclaim and decided to step away, to go into seclusion in Cornish, New Hampshire, and again, we believe, keep writing the whole time, but never publishing. I mean, I'm not immune to any of that stuff I was goofing on about the, posting content, living our brands, etc. I make this, for gosh sakes. I insist on putting this out in the world every week in hopes of what? I'm not entirely sure. I got a nice postcard this morning from a listener who told me he was remiss in not writing me earlier to tell me about what a great run of episodes I've been on lately. From the inside, I don't see any of that. So it is nice to hear, and it's nice making that connection. And I mean, during my conference this week, I'm going to be Mr. Wonderful and have this different public face that'll greet my business life, and I'll be playing up my role running this trade association and networking with everyone and trying to remember what I said to whom. But I think we all get that the mystery of silence too, and what Salinger's withdrawal embodies. Anyway, the major themes that Salinger's soul gets into, as Steve puts it in our talk, is Salinger's embrace of Vedanta Hinduism and his embrace of barely legal women a lot. Steve doesn't get salacious with the details, but he does establish this longstanding trend on Salinger's part when it comes to sex and to women. And all those contradictions, the writer who won't publish, the sex-forward Vedanta devotee, Vedanta being a famously almost celibate faith, as well as him as Salinger being a Jew who denounces his Judaism, liberates a concentration camp, marries a German woman after the war and tries to pass her off as French. All that stuff is it fills the book. It's whirling like electrons around this invisible nucleus. And in this wonderful prose that Steve has, which comes from his 50-year-plus career as a journalist and editor, he brings us as close as we can get to that unknowable core. And the promise that Salinger kept writing all those years in absentia is maybe a notion that there's some meaning or reconciliation in the world, if we know where to look. Anyway, I'm on one of my flights. Go get Salinger's Soul. It's out now from Post Hill Press by Stephen B. Shepard. It's a great read about an enigma of an author who speaks to all of us, I think. Now, here's Stefan's bio, or Steve's bio. Stephen B. Shepard is the founding Dean Emeritus of the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at City University of New York. He served as a senior editor at Newsweek, the editor of Saturday Review, and editor-in-chief of Business Week. From 1992 to 1994, he was president of the American Society of Magazine Editors. He was also a faculty member at the Columbia Journalism School, where he was co-founder and first director of the Knight Bagehot, B-A-G-H-O-T, I just mangled that one, the Knight Bagehot Fellowships, a mid-career program for working journalists. A native New Yorker, Steve graduated from the Bronx High School of Science, then received his bachelor's degree from the City College of New York and his master's degree from Columbia University. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Stephen B. Shepard. So before I ask where Salinger began for you, where did Salinger's soul begin? When did you feel you were ready to write this?
Yeah, those are two different questions. You're right. Well, in 2018, I wrote a book about the Jewish American writers, Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, Bernard Malamud, Cynthia Ozick, and so on. And I thought of putting Salinger in that book. But when I looked into it, his Jewishness was very, very complicated, which we can talk about. So I didn't do it. But then when COVID hit in March of 2020, everybody was stuck at home, and I pulled out the Salinger material and started to write the book, which became Salinger's Soul. So it's sort of a COVID book in a way. Yeah. And I often think, well, if COVID hadn't happened, would I have done this book? And I don't, I like to think I would have, but because I enjoyed it so much. But that's how the book started.
And where did Salinger start for you?
Oh, God. Well, that goes way back.
I figure.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't quite old enough. Catcher in the Rye came out in 1951. And I was just not quite old enough to read it. But, maybe 5 years later I was, because everybody seemed to be reading and talking about Catcher in the Rye. So that's when it really started. I read it. My first reading of it, other people have told me this too, I said, well, what's the big deal about? Here's this teenage kid. Everybody's screwed up when they're teenagers. And, he goes to New York. All right. So I didn't quite get it, and maybe I was just too young to get it. So I don't know, a year or two later, I went back and read it, and it was sort of dawning on me that this was really a good book. And now that I'm, looking back on it from all these years, I rereading it now, I think, oh my God, it really is a remarkable book.
And tell me about that experience, how it grew on you and what it means to you ultimately.
Well,
not in a John Hinckley sort of way, but it was Mark David Chapman. Damn it, I knew I was going to throw that reference.
I deliberately did not put him in the book. I didn't want to get into all that. And I can't even explain it anyway, why that book attracted all these crazy people. But but for me, there were two identifying issues. And one was, Holden Caulfield and the anguish of being a teenager. And it's easier to look back on the anguish of being a teenager once you've gone through it, it's all done. And he did it brilliantly. So that was very, very compelling. And I think that's why a lot of young people glommed onto it, that it was their story. And, oh, my God, this is sort of universal. It's not just me who's screwed up, So there was that. And also it was the comment on society at large. I mean, part of what Holden Caulfield was rebelling against was what he called the phoniness and the materialism and the conformity of present-day America, call it 1950s America, which was complacent. And, after the war, we all settled in, and the Eisenhower years, and it was a period of complacency and materialism and conformity. And that's what Holden was rebelling against, and that caught on with a lot of college-age students in the late 50s. In other words, it took probably 8-10 years before the book became the sensation it has become. In the beginning, it did all right. It was at number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list, but it wasn't what it became. Then it became, And the thing is selling 200,000 copies a year. This is 70 years after it was published, and there are 65 million copies that have already been sold. I mean, there's nothing else like it. It's extraordinary.
It's one of those things, and you mention it in the book, the contemporary pushback against it. This is just some rich white kid's perspective and blah, blah, blah. And why is this special? And it's something that occurred to me when I reread it a few years ago, that I don't think that voice existed prior to this. And in that Harold Bloom sense, you do cite Bloom at one point, that sense of uncanniness where something is so unique, we don't recognize that it didn't exist before this, that voice became so natural to all of us. We assumed it was always there, and this is just some pastiche, as opposed to a guy actually evoked this and managed to make it work for,
Well, that's because of Salinger's great gift as a writing dialogue. I mean, he wasn't the best storyteller around. He's not famous for his plots. But for character and dialogue, he was unsurpassed. And Holden is a first-person book written. Holden, people don't remember this, but Holden was a mental institution when he was talking this book. So you get this unique voice and this unique dialogue that really nobody was as good as Salinger's dialogue. And that, I think, carried it. Everybody said, oh, my God, this kid is really real.
So tell me about bringing Salinger himself to life, given the absolute seclusion of his second half.
Yeah, and I didn't succeed any more than anybody else did. I didn't even try to go up to Cornish, New Hampshire. When he was alive, he died in 2010, but he was in my mind earlier. But some people went, and of course they got nowhere. But you just start by reading everything that's been written about him. There have been biographies before. There are plenty of newspaper and magazine articles, and they're actually PhD dissertations, some of which are quite revealing, and you can find out about him because other people have discovered them, written about him before. So there's a rich field of, let's call it literature, about his literature, which is very compelling, and I learned a lot. Obviously, it would have been better to talk to him. I even tried to talk to his son, Matt Salinger, who lives in Connecticut now and is pulling together all the material that Salinger wrote but didn't publish. His last published story was in 1965 in the New Yorker. And he was writing every day for the next 45 years. So there's, as Matt said, just a lot of stuff. And he's going to release it. Been working on it for almost 10 years. I don't know when it's coming out. He won't talk to me. And so it's either going to be imminent in the next few weeks or it could be a year away. I have no idea. But he's near the end, I'm guessing. But he's like his father, like son. He doesn't talk to anybody either. His public comments all stem from 5 years ago, 2019, when the New York Public Library had a nice Salinger exhibition of manuscripts and artifacts and so on. And he spoke to the press at that time, and so we have some sense of what he's up to. But it's going to be a major event. One of these days, we're going to wake up and read that all of Salinger's unpublished work is now available, whether it's being published by publishers or he's just putting it out there. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be a major big deal.
I'm still in that sort of Charles Portis type world where nothing really is there. I still have this belief that, either he was scribbling the whole time or what's there is one of those, oh my God, we can't publish this, and they just kind of, I refer to Portis just in the locked box sort of way, where there's just something hidden in a chest and we never find the key to it. But I have no idea.
My guess is it's there. Okay. Yeah. The question to me, and it's probably mostly short stories because that's essentially what he was. Even The Catcher in the Rye is a sort of an assemblage of a bunch of short stories. But I think the material is there. I believe that. The question is, how good is it going to be? Yeah. And I'm not too optimistic because his last published works were really not good. Yeah. His last story in 1965 in the New Yorker, Hapworth 16, it took up the whole issue of the New Yorker, 28,000 words or something like that. And it really was awful. Yeah. And even the last Glass stories, they weren't that bad, but they weren't really very good after Franny and Race High, the Roof Beam Carpenters, which were pretty good. And the last two, Seymour and Introduction, and what was the other one? Slips my mind. Were really not very good. Zooey, the Zooey companion to Franny, but it was much longer and not nearly as good. So I'm just worried that we have this great expectations. Then he publishes all this stuff, and it's, oh my God.
Stares at it.
But I keep thinking all those years, something had to be good. There got to be one thing in there that's really good.
If anything, there'll be more PhD dissertations.
Well, that's for sure, yes.
But tell me about your approach when it came to the book. I mean, you take the life chronologically, but you dive in certain ways. Talk a little about how you approach the material.
Yeah, well, I want it to be a biography, okay, not a work of literary criticism. There's been a ton written about Catcher in the Rye and the 9 stories and Franny and Zooey and so on. That is literary criticism done by scholars and so forth. And, you have to acknowledge it and say what it's about. But basically, I wanted to tell his story because in my reading, that was the hardest thing to piece together. We all know he went up to Cornish, New Hampshire in 1953 and stayed there for the next 45 years. And what we don't know is what he did during that time. We have bits and pieces from here and there. So I wanted to cobble that together to tell the story of his life in seclusion and why he became famous for not wanting to be famous. That's really what happened. And I think that contributed to his success. Everybody not only was interested in reading Catcher, but who is this guy? Yeah.
Why won't he keep talking to the press and do something?
Well, there was one funny quote. There was a guy who never liked Catcher in the Rye, and he said, if I had written that book, I would have gone into hiding too. But that's a real minority because the book was so successful and is so wonderful. So So I wanted to just explore what he did up there, and I found out quite a lot. And the two themes of the book are the religious odyssey, that is, the transformation of a kid who has had a bar mitzvah, raised Jewish, had a bar mitzvah at 13. And then when they found out that their mother really wasn't Jewish, even though she pretended to be, he and his older sister, who was 19 at the time, just ended their relationship with Judaism. And he went on to these mystical, first of all, Zen Buddhism. And then,
as you and I know, you never get away from Judaism.
Well, that's right.
which haunted him his entire life and haunts both of us. But,
that's right. Yeah. So, but I wanted to trace that odyssey. Why do you embrace something like this mystical form of Hinduism called Vedanta, which I had never heard of until I started looking into the Salinger stuff? And I asked a lot of people, and they'd never heard of it either. But even though there were other practitioners, including Tolstoy, once upon a time. So there's that part of the book, the religious odyssey. And the other that interests me is the personal odyssey, which essentially means the women in his life. And what it turned out is that he had this obsession with these post-adolescent women. And everybody knows about Joyce Maynard. And she was 18 and dropped out of Yale after her freshman year to go live with him when he was 53. Everybody knows about that. But what they don't know is there were a lot of Joyce Maynards. There were a lot of other women in his life who exactly fit that description. And he had this thing this obsession with these young women. It's been mentioned in various places, but not gone into detail in a lot of most of the time. So
connecting the dots, or connecting the dots.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And now, why he was this way, how it come, you can psychoanalyze it's about his father, his mother, all that stuff. But I don't really know. I just wanted to lay out what was happening in his life all those years.
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you one of the interesting aspects or coincidental and funny aspects of the book to me was you represent his gateway to Vedanta is The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham. Yeah. When I was 16 years old in high school, we're supposed to pick a book off the list for this term paper in my English class. And I thought, instead of anything on the list, I would bring up The Razor's Edge because my mom always had it on the shelf and I'd always wanted to read it and this would be an excuse. And my English teacher said, "No, Gil, you're not going to read that. I think you're going to pick Catcher in the Rye." I said, no, Rocco, I really want to do The Razor's Edge. "No, Gil, you want to read Catcher in the Rye." So he pushed me to Salinger with Maugham as my backup. But I thought it was funny that Razor's Edge managed to weave its way back into my Salinger story as this stuff works. The idea of pushing Catcher in the Rye on a 16-year-old, I'm a little bit suspicious of, like what he saw in me, that he felt this was the book I needed to read. But that's...
Well, I find it interesting when I talk to women who read Catcher in the Rye and really enjoy it.
Yeah.
Because I've talked to women who say, that's a boy's book, that's a man's book, it has no relationship to me.
Yeah.
And I can see that argument. I mean, what happens to Holden and how he thinks and so on is very related to growing up and making the transition from boy to man, and you can't get away from that. But women who like it say there's a universality to it. Everybody goes through a transition in adolescence. The details are different, and maybe they're more different for women than they are for men. But I can identify with that, and I can even, understand it from my point of view and relate it to my going through this adolescence. Everybody has a problem with it. It's by definition,
That's what adolescence is. That's how we become, quote unquote, adults. But to that end, falling back on our title, where is Salinger's soul?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very much in the religion, was very much in the religion. I mean, and he got into, he said as much indirectly that one of the reasons he was attracted to religion was that he thought it would help cure his depression, the depression stemming from what happened to him in World War II, which we can talk about. But he was depressed on and off for the rest of his life, and his embrace of religion was an attempt by trying to understand God and having a relationship with God that it would help him. And I don't think it really did, but he got very, very into these religions, first starting with Zen Buddhism and then Vedanta. He was a serious practitioner. He was no dilettante. He did it every day. He meditated. He read the sacred texts. He went to the Vedanta Center in New York. This is for a man who didn't leave Cornish, New Hampshire very much. He was very involved, and he had a relationship with the swamis at this Vedanta center. So he was very serious about it, and I respect that. I mean,
he was trying, and he wasn't half-assing it. Yeah,
that's right. He was and it was a big part of his life. And and I also think that it is one of the reasons he stopped publishing what he was writing. He never stopped writing, by all accounts, but he stopped publishing after 1965. And the reason is related to Vedanta, because one of the things that Vedanta preached against was acts of ego. It's not about you, it's about your relationship with God. That's the principle of the religion, and you're supposed to become one with God. And he violated that. That was the only credo of Vedanta that I think he violated, because he was a serious practitioner. He did not
celibacy, as you
he did not agree with their edict against sex, basically, except in marriage, and then only for the purposes of procreation. So they didn't really, sex and fun were not to be equated at all. And he obviously, there was a lot of sex in his life. It's interesting. There's no sex in his fiction.
Yeah.
There's nothing in Catcher. I mean, there are the overtones of it because he's an adolescent, and he attempts to, have this relationship with this prostitute, which doesn't work, and so forth. But that's it. There's no description of sex in Catcher.
His gay fear with the teacher at one
with
point.
The teacher,
yeah. But yeah, you're right. It's a weirdly sexless world, and I'd wondered whether Vedanta led him to that silence, or whether Vedanta gave him the excuse to withdraw.
I think they were mutually reinforcing.
He needed something to get himself out of the publishing fame.
The other thing about Salinger that I realized in writing this book is that this is maybe related to sex, he almost never wrote about relationships between two mature adults. Yeah. Most of the relationships in Salinger's stories are between people for whom sex is essentially ruled out, for example, between brothers and sisters, or between parent and child. Those are his relationships. And a lot of those relationships are with very young people. In this Sybil, banana fish, perfect day for banana fish, Sybil, who Seymour meets on the beach, is 4 years old. And in the short story, Teddy is 10. And Holden's sister, Phoebe Caulfield, is also 10, and is a brilliant description of their relationship in Catcher in the Rye. So he was very comfortable about writing about young people, and the relationships are almost always between an older person and a child, basically.
And again, not in a
sexualized
sex manner.
But that's right.
Really interesting.
But he wouldn't go the next step. What about these people when they grow up?
Yeah.
Well, he didn't write about them. Try to imagine Holden Caulfield as a grown-up.
Well, we see him as an ad executive or something weird like that, and complete sellout. But that would be the 50s, 60s. But yeah, it's fascinating to me. Again, that idea of the silence and of the withdrawal. At that point, not having the fame, but not having the resources yet. It's one thing to say I'm going to withdraw when you've sold 30 million of their 65 million copies. When you withdraw,
it wasn't even that.
When you withdraw a lot earlier, it's a riskier proposition, I suppose.
Well, it was even when he did, because he moved to Cornish in 1953. That's just 2 years after Catcher, and 9 Stories was just about to come out. So he wasn't, he was successful, but he wasn't making a lot of money, not like what happened to him afterwards. He never had to worry about it again.
But I guess in the question of, what you learned about Vedanta, what did you learn about Salinger? What did the book really teach you about what did you learn in the process, or how did your approach to Salinger change?
One of the things I learned is that he wasn't the complete recluse that everybody makes him out to be. Yeah. He left Cornish when it was convenient. He came to New York to see William Shawn, the editor of the New Yorker, quite frequently. Mm-hmm. He hung out at the Gotham Book Mart, which was a famous bookstore with a lot of old books on 47th Street in the Garment District in New York. And he went to see his wartime buddy, John Keenan, at his retirement party, which was in New York. He once drove down from Cornish all the way to Washington, D.C. to meet with a guy who was interested in making a book out of a film out of Hapworth, which was his least successful story. He actually met with this guy, and he met with him in a very public place, the cafeteria at the National Gallery in Washington. Well, a real recluse does not do those things. So there are many examples of where he came out of hiding to do things.
I'll say I have friends who, they run the cartooning library and museum out in Columbus, and they did a big exhibition of Bill Watterson, the guy who did Calvin and Hobbes, who's been in hiding for decades. And he visited them to help with the exhibition, and the three of them went to a cafeteria, and my friend told me she had this moment of realizing, I'm sitting with Bill Watterson and absolutely nobody knows who he is because nobody's seen a picture of this guy in 30 or 40 years. And it's just, this is why he did it, because the fame and the money is nice, but he'll take less of that to be able to just...
And people in general did not recognize Salinger when he's sitting in a cafeteria.
You wouldn't think that. Is that J.D. Salinger?
Yeah, you wouldn't think that. And he was tall and gaunt and gray, and but he did get out. Is my point, And the other thing I discovered about him, that he wasn't completely the recluse that he's made out to be, is just the stuff with the obsession with these young women. I mean, I knew about Joyce Maynard, of course, but I just thought, well, okay, that's one. But
this is like the Secret Life of John le Carré that came out last year. Also, the biographer had when I read the biography, I felt something weird happened around the 1970s, and then this book comes out. I'm like, oh, that's what happened. He found all the letters and talked to le Carré about it. He's like, yeah, don't talk about those. And so waited until le Carré and his wife were dead, and then all of these affairs. And a lot of them begin with fan letters and people that sound interesting, and then not quite the same demographic as Salinger was pursuing, but it's the writer's life, I guess. I don't know.
And there was also the relationship between him and his two children. He had a daughter named Peggy, Margaret was her name, and she and a brother 4 years younger than she, named Matt Salinger, and he ended up having a falling out with his daughter, mostly because she wrote a very nasty book about him in the year 2000, 10 years before he died, in which she blamed him for neglect and being a bad father in one way or another, and it just went on pages. It wasn't the entire book, but that's what got all the headlines.
That's what people wanted to find out about.
Yeah, I didn't want to find out about that. I didn't want it to be true, but they never spoke to each other again. On the other hand, his relationship with his son Matt was very, very close.
Yeah. And in the book, you mentioned that Matt does not feel that was an accurate representation of what their life was like.
Correct. So, well, two children who grow up in the same household and have totally different views of their parents or one parent or what they're... And, that it is subjective, but it could also have been different, that he had a different relationship with her than he did with him. Who knows? But she felt that way and wrote a book. And Matt is absolutely right. I mean, whatever she felt, she shouldn't have gone public and written a book about it. I mean, what's that,
It was a world where,
I know.
sensationalism sells, which again, when you're raised, her mother split with Salinger, but when the whole mentality you're raised around is this writer working in silence for silence, that's got to mess with you in certain ways about how you relate to the outer world, I guess.
There's no question. And he wasn't saying that she was wrong to have the feeling she had about her father. This is Matt. Just that she shouldn't go public with it. And I don't think she did it to make money. I just think she needed to get it out. Mm-hmm. And for her, going public was a big part of it. It isn't that I'm going to tell my brother what I felt about my father, which she did or she didn't. I have no idea. But to go public with it was really the thing that took it to another level, And he never responded, of course.
That we know of, but I'm sure there's in those scraps that Matt is going through, there's probably some parallel version of this.
Well, maybe
we'll find out, but
or not. I'm worried we won't find it out.
That's still my vibe, because again, I remember when all this started, and it was we've got these vaults of everything. I'm like. The analog I came up with, rather than this, there was Harold Brodkey going 28 years before The Runaway Soul comes out, and then everybody's saying, okay, and kind of shunting it off to the side. B, the documentary about Robert Crumb that came out in the early 90s, the underground cartoonist, where his brother, older brother, who was the one who forced all of the other children into forming their own little comics company as children, kept drawing as he was suffering more and more mental health decline. And they show these panels where he starts focusing on drapery in the clothing, like getting the drapery right. And then you see years later, that's all there is. It's just drapery. You can't see anything else. It's just lines and lines and lines. And this is my fear about the Salinger stuff, that we're going to come across maybe, 800 pages of Vedanta text or something that's done in a way that we can't really grasp. But it's all going to be a mystery. And that's.
Well, I think Matt is going to bring some judgment to bear on all this. Yeah. And he has not said anything. But once this stuff comes out, there are going to be two questions that any journalist would raise, which is, what is this stuff that we're seeing now? Short stories, another novel, how good is it? What do critics say? Blah, blah, blah. And that's going to take time, because if there's a lot of stuff, it's going to take time for people to read all this and think about it. But the other question is about Matt. What was the process like going through all this material, some of which were just notes and fragments of stories, to piece this together? How did you do this? What took 10 years? What was it like to do? Was there something that you read right away and say, I don't have to touch this at all. It's a finished story. It's great, whatever. Or did you have a lot of piecing together to do? That's going to be a story, too. What do you do with 45 years of material from a writer like Salinger?
Earlier this summer, I sat down with Marana Comstock, who was a granddaughter of Conrad Berkovici, who apparently was this phenomenally successful writer in the interwar period into the 40s and beyond, who is now, again, we both look with blankness at his name. She came across this sort of chest with all this writing from various family members and found this book of his memoir about the Algonquin Round Table. And figures between that and some essay sketches or profiles of people, she would look around for a publisher. They jump on the Algonquin book, and it was one of those things where she was like, the prose was perfect. I mean, I had to do a little clarifying items here and there, but he just wrote this absolutely amazing thing, and it was just sitting in this chest, never published. And, so I'm hoping, yes, with Salinger, we do have some things that were finished. I wonder with Matt, the archaeology of it, like sort of what you were saying, like how were the pieces dated? How does he assemble the jigsaw puzzle of some of these things? That can be really...
And is there anything he's not releasing? And if so, why?
Yeah. That'll be...
Well, part of them will say, it wasn't a complete thing, or it didn't have that much merit. But then scholars will say, no, we want to see everything he wrote.
Well, this gets us to the Philip Roth biography story, which, the idea that Roth's notes were given to the biographer, who ended up scandalized and having the biography pulled, with the question of whether he was going to destroy all the notes after or leave them for other researchers to pursue is it's a whole thing of, what literary biography is, I guess, and how we try to rebuild these figures'
lives. My view about it is that you have to make a distinction between the person and what's written about him. Yeah. And that, I forgot his name, Blake Bailey, who wrote this book. I thought the book was really good. Okay. And I read it before,
everything happened.
But I think it was a mistake for Norton to withdraw that book from circulation. Now somebody else picked it up.
Silver Horse or someone.
And you can get it. But, because what they were saying was, this book doesn't stand on its own as a portrait of Philip Roth. We're taking out of circulation because this guy committed some sexual harassment or rape or whatever. Well, if that's the case, then prosecute him for rape. Why should you censor a book that he wrote? Why is censorship the appropriate punishment for a crime of rape? That makes no sense to me.
Unless, and I'm with you on this, except that this is the greatest Zuckerman plot that ever existed. Yeah. If Roth was going to write what happens to Zuckerman's biography, this would be the story.
That's very funny.
Yeah, because that's what hit me afterwards. I'm like, Roth couldn't have written this more perfectly. Yeah. This is he finally trusts someone, gets the biography done, and then posthumously it all
I didn't see a lot of this written. Everybody just said, well, the guy's a rapist, so why should they publish his book? They published Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, and they're not going to publish a biography of Philip Roth, which everybody said. Cynthia Ozick wrote a front page review in the New York Times Book Review praising this book as a very good biography, which it was. And Norton pulls it out because the author did bad things. You got to separate the book from the writer.
And we were in the middle of that era. Also, the Me Too era was particularly heavy.
Would you think it would be different if it happened today?
I don't know. There's some issues going on now with certain writers and accusations that are not being treated as severely as they would have been in like 2018, 2019, that era. But, it can also just be certain writers have fan bases. As much as everybody loves David Bowie had some scandals in his youth that were involving underage women, and everybody kind of shunts that aside because we love David Bowie. I'm like, okay, we've got our standards and double standards that we apply to a lot of these situations. Bailey and I were scheduled to record, or we were planning to record that fall, and then everything blew up, and I was like, well, I guess I'm not going to hear from him. That's the book.
I can't remember about Blake Bailey and specifically whether there were any young women in that.
I don't think there was a grooming thing. It was girls he knew when he was teaching middle school that he was waiting for them.
But he didn't touch them before they were 18.
But it was when they were 18.
Well, that's 19. Interesting because that's true of Salinger as well. He never molested anybody under 18, never had sex with anybody who was under 18, but you can argue that he groomed them by letter writing and all of that, and then when they became of age, relationships started.
It was a different time, but it's still, it's a fraught territory.
But what's wrong and right here? I mean, if he does not touch anyone who's under 18 and waits till they're 18 and then has a consensual relationship, is that to be condemned? I mean, if he met them when they were 19 instead of meeting them when they were 14, that makes such a big difference, even though there was no sex until they were 18 or 19. I don't know.
And to your credit, you don't go diving into or wading into that territory so significantly. It's there as a shadow throughout, that aspect of Salinger's career. I want to ask, did you read Sergeant Salinger, the novel by Jerome Charon, a couple of years ago? Focuses on the World War II.
I don't believe I read it.
I'll voice it off on you. I've got an extra copy because
it's
good.
It's an interesting I'm aware of it. I don't know why I didn't read it, actually. I read so much.
I think it came out after you
it did.
Started that. I think it was 22 or 23.
Oh, so it was,
But it also focuses on what we assume is the real trauma of Salinger's life, which is what happens at the end of the war.
Yeah. This is look, he landed at Normandy on D-Day, and he was in continuous combat for the next 10 months until the war ended. He went through France and part of the liberation of Paris. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, Hurtgen Forest. He saw some really serious fighting, and 2/3 of the division that he was attached to was killed or wounded in the war. So they get to Germany and the war ends, and then a week or two later, or maybe it was a week or two before, right around the end of the war, they liberated a concentration camp, which was a sub-camp of Dachau. And his unit marched in there, and the Germans had fled, and he saw, the dead Jews, the dying Jews, the emaciated Jews. He saw the whole horror of the thing, and mostly all Jews in that particular place. And 2 weeks later, or 3 weeks later, he had a nervous breakdown. So he got through this 10 months of horrible fighting and death all around him, sees this concentration camp, and it's then that he has a nervous breakdown. So I can't prove it, but it seems to me that it's associated with the concentration camp and the Jewishness in him that triggered this. And from then on, he really was not the same person after the war, certainly after the concentration camp. And then he stayed on in Germany. He was a member of the counterintelligence corps for the United States, and he stayed in Germany. He met and married a German woman. And because he was still in the army, because it was illegal for an American soldier to marry a German, they passed her off as French. She spoke good French, and so did he. And he helped do some papers that made it seem as if she were really French. And then they lived together in Germany until a year later, and then they went back to the United States. He brought her back, and they lived with Salinger's parents on Park Avenue, and it lasted a month until his mother threw her the hell out. She realized that she was German.
And that's
I can imagine.
I understand the rebelling against one's Judaism, but that's another level to go to. And I always wonder whether that's how conscious he was of this as a motivation for why he was doing what he was doing. Or
well,
was
there
he
were
just
some
driven
rumors
by this?
around the time or thereafter. There was things saying, well, her name was Sylvia Welter, and that she really was affiliated with the Nazi Party in some way. Yeah. But there are some scholars who went back and dug through a lot of the papers in Germany and all that, and concluded that so she had nothing to do with the Nazis. She was German. Yeah. She was an ophthalmologist, actually, and she went to medical school in Germany. But being German was bad enough after the war, so that's what did him in. Anyway, and that was the end of that. It was his first marriage. Amazing.
Having written this book, and again, not including him in your Judaism and writers, would you replace him in that pantheon? Or
well,
do you think he is?
Yeah,
isolated.
Very interesting question. I mean, I could make the case for putting him in a book about Jewish American writers of that era. Mm-hmm. Because he was part of an era, a post-war era in the United States in which the Jewish writers were ascended in a way they never were before. I mean, there was some stuff in the 20s and 30s,
but no, we're talking
not
Bellow, Roth, et cetera.
The Nobel Prizes came after the war and all that stuff. But they weren't all Jewish to the same degree. There were some observant Jews. There were people who were not Jewish at all, didn't want to have any association with it, but they never embraced another religion. Salinger is different because he embraced another religion. But you can make the case that that's a kind of Jewish, that's what happened to some Jews. There were other Jews who converted too. He never formally converted, but there were other Jews who embraced other religions. And that was one of the Jewish outcomes in a way. There were people like that. So I could have put him in that book. And if I had it to do over again, would I? Well, I'm happy I did a separate book. Yeah, sure. But I can see now in retrospect that there would have been nothing wrong with putting him in that book and explaining. Now, the book would have more focused. The chapter would have been not quite what I've done now because I'm writing about his relationship with women. I'm writing about the books. I'm writing about a lot of things. If I put him in the Jewish Writers book, I would have just focused on his Jewishness and his transition to something else, and it would have been a chapter or two. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't have been this book. So it could have gone in there. I'm glad it didn't because I got a whole other book that didn't belong in the other book.
I do have to pick up the Jewish Writers book, though, so that's going to be my homework after this.
I'll give you a copy.
Oh, good. Tell me where that began for you, tell me where that began for you.
Well, that was easy because I realized that in my formative years, which is to say in the 50s and 60s, you
were the background.
Yeah, I graduated high school in 1956. I was very young, but I was in college, graduated in 61, and so I would say in those years of early college, late 50s and 60s, when Salinger was just catching on, is where I realized, in retrospect, that most of the writers I was reading were Jewish. Now, I read John Updike, who was one of my favorites, and Virginia Woolf has always been one of my favorites, but a lot of them were Jewish. I mean, Saul Bellow certainly, and Philip Roth certainly, and Malamud, and Cynthia Ozick, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Arthur Miller's play, Death of a Salesman. I mean, Willy Loman is not specifically Jewish, but he sure as hell is. Yeah. I mean, and I wrote a chapter about that actually in the Jewish Writers book. But so it just seemed to me, what was this fascination? Was it just because I was Jewish and was reading Jewish writers, or was it that was who was out and about and in those days? Which was certainly true. I mean, everybody was reading these writers. You didn't have to be Jewish to read Saul Bellow, Anyway, so that's what started it. And it just was natural back then. But then thinking about it in retrospect, all these years later, I said, well, what was that all about, And what did it mean, reading Jewish writers and their forms of Jewishness? I mean, in the debate between Saul Bellow and Philip Roth and Bernard Malamud about what it means to be Jewish is in one of those books. And it was just very important to read that stuff.
And how did it shape your Judaism? And how did the writing the book?
It confirmed that it was okay to be a secular Jew. Mm-hmm. You could have a Jewish identity, be very much a Jew, without being a religious person. And most of those writers were secular Jews. There were just one or two, Cynthia Ozick, who was among them, who was a religious person. Saul Bellow certainly wasn't. Philip Roth certainly wasn't. So, that's what it told me, that it was okay to be a secular Jew.
And your relation to religion? How's that? If it's not too personal a question, how's it evolved?
It's not. It has evolved partly because my wife is more observant than I am. And so because of that, I got more engaged with it. And we have 2 children. We raised them as Jewish, and they had bar and bat mitzvahs and so on. But, they're not.
We are in the Upper West Side. So we are in the Upper West Side.
Well, they both live in Los Angeles, as it turns out, but there's some Jews in L.A. too. Yeah. So, it very much became part of my identity. And being Jewish, unlike some religions, there's so much more to being Jewish than just the religious part of it. It is a culture. It is a way of life. And culturally, there's no question I identify with it, even without being religious. And my parents were religious for a time. They had a kosher home, and my father went to synagogue on the holidays. I sat with him and so on. I went to Hebrew school for 4 years and had a bar mitzvah and so on. And so, there's no question. I am Jewish. There's no question about it. But there are many ways to be Jewish, and that's what I don't want people to forget. And I never criticize anybody in the way they are Jewish. If you're Jewish and you want to be religious, fine. If you don't want to be religious, it's okay with me. You want to go to a Reform synagogue or an Orthodox synagogue, it's all up to you. There are very many ways to be Jewish, and it's more than just a religion.
It's like whenever I pass the mitzvah tank, they know. They just, you haven't had to fill it. I'm like, okay, you identified me. It's pretty obvious. So, I go in and get phylactery up. But, not exactly my level of practice, but it's okay. Yeah. There was an interesting aspect of the book that you bring up, the biography of Salinger that was written quoting a number of his letters that basically he sued about in court and got blocked. This
is the Ian Hamilton book. Yeah.
So the final version of this doesn't include letters or even much paraphrasing thereof. But you mentioned that you picked up one of the review copies of this book, which does have all of the material. A, how useful was it? B, how awesome is it to be one of the few, or the 65 copies that exist?
It's the galley. I have it here on my bookshelf, and I'll show it to you. Awesome. There are only 65 of them, so I feel good about having that. No, it's interesting to see the quotes, but the issue is not the content of the quotes because they're innocuous. They're interesting because it's Salinger talking about one thing or another. Yeah. And there aren't that many of them, given that he had almost 100 letters, so he could have done a lot more with it. But they're interesting because they're Salinger saying he just didn't want them in there, not because of what they said, but because he thought Hamilton had no right to his unpublished letters written as a private citizen to other friends of his. And, he has a point. He went to court, and it was a very famous case. And it is today the law of the land. If you have my unpublished letters, you can own them. I can't stop you from owning them, but legally I can stop you from publishing them in any forum to this day.
And does that hold up after Salinger's death, too, if they wanted to reissue that early one? I have no idea what the law
Well, I think that the law would apply in general because the next person who is going to bring a case is not going to be Salinger. It's going to be somebody else who felt his unpublished letters were taken unfairly and illegally now by somebody else for their purposes in their own book. So, I think it's still the law of the land.
I just wasn't sure if Salinger's estate can still sue for that or if after his death it becomes fair game. But Hamilton would have, or his people would have done something by now with it, I guess, if they could have.
Well, it's a long time ago, and it's a different, situation. Although I can imagine somebody now who's well known, who has unpublished letters that he wrote to other people, and they ended up in the public libraries, which is what happened to those Salinger letters. I can imagine somebody saying, "I don't want you to publish my letters. I wrote this letter to Gil Roth. I don't want anybody else to see it."
I say now it's all email. There's no drafts or anything.
There's that. That's a whole other. Yes.
Veering in another direction. Tell me about your journalism history. And we were commiserating before starting here about my upbringing in business-to-business magazines, where you also started. But tell me about your history with journalism, your book, and where you see it headed at present.
Yeah, well, that's a huge topic. Well, let me just start by saying I was an engineering student in college and in graduate school. So I have a master's degree in engineering from Columbia, it turns out. And I never wanted to be an engineer. I wanted to be a journalist, but I ran away from it because it was too scary, and I didn't know quite how to do it. And I had an uncle who was an engineer, and blah blah. So I started off on the wrong foot to begin with, and then finally made the transition by being a science writer, to use the background I had. And that's when I worked on a trade magazine. It was called Product Engineering, and it was published by McGraw-Hill, and this would have been in the 60s. And then from there, it was, easier, because now I'm a journalist. Yes, I'm writing about science and technology, but I'm a journalist. And I switched to Business Week, first starting writing about science and technology, and then gradually other things. And overseas, I worked in the London bureau for them, and I was writing about all kinds of things. So, and then just spent the rest of my career as a journalist at Newsweek and at Business Week, and was the editor-in-chief of Business Week for 20 years, and then started a graduate school of journalism at the City University of New York. So I am through and through a journalist, and loved every minute of it. And I got there in a cockeyed way, but it worked out just fine. So it's very, distressing to see what is happening to the kind of journalism I practiced. I mean, Newsweek, where I worked for 5 years, and my wife was the first woman senior editor at Newsweek, Lynn Povich, to see that magazine essentially doesn't exist. It used to have 3 million circulation. If it exists at all today, and I never see it, it has 50,000 at most.
And I think there's some weird scandal behind who owns it. I forget
that's
what
right. So
the
it essentially doesn't exist. And Business Week, which does exist, only exists because Michael Bloomberg took it off the hands of McGraw-Hill for no amount of money and decided to call it Bloomberg Business Week, and it's still being published. So that saddens me that the traditional form of journalism has gone away. But I also understand there's a whole new form of journalism that started, new outlets like ProPublica and Politico and Huffington Post, and anybody can be a journalist, and there's more journalism being done today on more platforms than any time in human history. So that's all to the good. It's just it isn't my world. I go online like everybody else. I even write online, but I grew up in a different world, and you get to a certain point, it never goes out of your head, even though you make a transition to the new way of doing things.
This was when I sat down with Clive James back in 2015 with this recording set up. He marveled because he said, when I was doing TV, even if it was just an audio thing, I'd have a whole crew, and you just show up with this little bag, and you can do this whole recording, and we're going to be, But what did you learn from starting the school and trying to teach and develop a curriculum for journalism in the 2000s as things are mutating rapidly? So.
What I learned is that everything I thought going in, not everything, but most everything was not quite right. And the students, know what they want and what they wanted to do. Yes, they want to learn what I call the eternal verities of journalism, which is to say good reporting, good writing, smart analysis, the traditional form of very good interpretive journalism. And we give them that. But in addition, you got to give them all this new stuff. And it's just everything, it's video and audio and all of these, what used to be different media formats, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, all different. They're all converged now. There's no difference. You write a story, some of it's with video. It could be a long written story, but it's still going to have a video component and interactive. It's now a two-way street. When I was a journalist, we were the writers and you were the audience. And maybe you'd write a letter to the editor every once in a while, but that was it. It was a one-way street. Now it's a two-way street. In fact, it's a multi-universe of everybody participating, and the audience talks back. And the audience of writers, everybody's a journalist now, or at least can practice journalism. And you don't need a license like to be a lawyer. You want to write a story, you write a story. So it's a different world, and I it isn't worse. It's just different.
There are degrees to which it's
in certain instances it's worse. But there were a lot of problems with the old way of doing things too, and so there are problems with the new way of doing it too. And some of it is very, very good, and some of it isn't. But that was always true.
That was part of my midlife crisis, quitting the Business to Business magazine and launching the trade association. At that point, I was 42, 43 years old, and thinking, 10 years are going to go by. I'm going to be in my early 50s, and I'm going to be a trade magazine editor, and this advertising base isn't going to survive. I'm going to be a white guy in his 50s trying to find work, which, as we know, is kind of a no man's land. So instead, I reinvented myself in this weird context, but it's still the magazine's still out there. I still see the people, they do more events now and not just the magazine itself. There's more things tied to it. There's video. There are all these other ways of trying to get eyeballs, I guess, which is the quote unquote monetization of everything.
Yeah. But it'd be hard to make an argument that we as a society are less well informed now than we were 30 years ago.
The information is there. It's a question of how willing we are to go get it. I guess.
Wasn't that always true in a way? You didn't have to subscribe to a newspaper in the old days either, you know. And maybe you'd put on the radio and listen to music and never turn on the news. So it was always, to some degree, if you were interested, you had to go get it. There was a quote, if the news is important, it will find me. That's a little more true today because of all these blogs and ways of reaching you and personalizing information for your particular tastes and interests. But people are informed. It's not that, if we screw up, it's not because we're uninformed. It's because we make the wrong decisions based on that information.
Definitely. How did the journalism writing inform book writing for you?
That's
How
a
different
good question.
Or those approaches?
For me, it isn't very different. Writing a book is an elongated form of the journalism that I did. So let's say a cover story in a news magazine is 5,000 words. This book is under 50,000 words, so call it 9-10 times as big as a cover story in a news magazine. To me, it's like 9 cover stories put together. It's like Salinger writing Catcher in the Rye by assembling a series of short stories. So I don't feel that I'm writing any differently. And if you look at the writing style, I had a couple of friends comment about this, that it's very much a kind of news magazine writing style in terms of those magazines were very good at what we used to call information density, packing a lot of information into a 3-column story, which may have been 600 or 700 words, but the sentences were so pregnant with information. It was that kind of good writing. And that's the way I grew up learning to write. And so I still write that way. There are more flourishes when you write a book and stuff like that.
But it's still, that's what surprised me. It's under 200 pages. Yeah. And it's got a fullness to it.
That's right. If I didn't write that way, the book would have been longer. And I don't think that would have been an advantage. I mean, because nobody says, I didn't understand this. They just read it,
It reminds me, when you mentioned Newsweek, that one of the first writers I ever met, David Gates, used to do book reviews for Newsweek. And these things would maybe be 2 or 3 paragraph squibs, and they were just full. Yeah. Everything that was that. And I'm sure that's the interplay of editor and writer. But once upon a time, we knew how to convey everything we needed to convey.
In a certain amount of space was a hell of a discipline. And it led to a writing style that, to me, is still very good because it's very economical and gives you a lot of information. I mean, this book is filled with a lot of information, and it's less than 50,000 words. That's less than 200 pages, as you say.
Phenomenon we have with online reading, where you end up basically just scanning a paragraph and pulling out the few couple of words that are actually of use as you keep scrolling up the screen. You ever written fiction?
No.
Okay, I wasn't sure if it was a...
No, it's not. Look, I got to say, fiction as a work of imagination is a higher art form than journalism is. Sure. I'll be the first one to say that. And I once tried writing a play, which is where everything has to be conveyed in the dialogue, so the narrative, the characters and everything, and I couldn't do it. I really couldn't do it, and I gave it up, and I've never really tried again. So the answer is no. But I'm a big reader of fiction, and I'm an admirer of fiction, but I've been very happy as a journalist. I don't lament the fact that I didn't write fiction. I really don't. Yeah. Even though I see it as a higher art form.
Yeah, but not the one you're... That's
right. It just wasn't me. And I was good at being a journalist. I just had some natural instinct for it. And I like to observe, particularly conflict, and write about it and try to sort out the right and wrong of a particular situation. So I think that psychologically I'm very suited to being a journalist. So, and I recognize that, and so I don't regret not writing the great American novel. Well, I might regret not writing the great American novel, but being a fiction writer is not something.
The great Stephen novel is not the one that we're dying for. Usually we get from people, you must have all these great stories from all the years of work. It's like, yeah, but that's not fiction. That's not a novel.
Correct.
Yeah. Although what you mentioned with the the approach to journalism, again, it reminds me before we started talking about Ron Rosenbaum, who also taught me the issue in any attempt at surveying a specific field. Go find the apostate. Find the guy who used to believe X and now believes the opposite. Go figure out his story, and you'll start getting whatever. The joke is, when I started in trade magazines in 1995, I was on 2 different books, Juvenile Merchandising and Auto Laundry News, the car wash industry trade journal.
There is such a thing?
Well, and this is the business journal. You moved out of that world. I will say, everybody has that reaction, and I always say, oh no, there wasn't one car wash trade magazine. There were 3 car wash trade magazines, because the moment one guy makes a dime in one of those spaces, 2 more guys will chisel in for a nickel. And I realized, and this is, incredibly esoteric and yet somehow works, the schism for oil change places between lifts and pits is literally theological. Like, they're literally, do you dig down into the earth, or are you elevating into the sky? And this is a mentality between guys who are pro-lift versus pro-pit. And I was like, wow, Rosenbaum was right. It doesn't matter how weird and mundane the topic is, you will find people who treat everything as though it's Catholic versus Protestant, level of conflict.
It must be this human nature to want contention and disagreement and fighting.
And I have to be right, and that guy has to be wrong.
Why don't we all just get along?
Now, it reminds me of I'm finishing My Struggle by Knausgaard, which the Norwegian writer, which has a huge 400-page essay near the end about why he named it My Struggle, which goes into Hitler, Jews, World War II, and everything else. And it put me in mind, reading this, of whether or not Salinger renounces being Jewish, whether you and I are assimilated Jews or not. I gesture outside. To them, we're Jews. It doesn't matter what we think we are or who we think we're going to be. We're always identified as something. And in this case, that identity carries with us throughout. It's not a sign that we therefore need to embrace, our identity as seen by somebody else. But it is something that for us maybe means something a little different than...
Well, I agree with that. I mean, in the sense that I think that's the way it is, that people identify people as Jewish. And it's because of what I said earlier, that I think they understand that Judaism is more than just a religion. Sure. It's a culture, it's a way of life, and so on. And somebody once said to this question, well, if you're an observant Jew or not an observant Jew, you still would have ended up in Hitler's
that's basically how I would have pushed that.
And then somebody said, well, why should we let Hitler be the definer of what Judaism is and who is a Jew, which is, of course, true. But there are distinctions and that don't exist for other religions. But that's okay. So it's an identity. And for all these thousands and thousands of years, it was a whole, and it was a segregated culture. And lived not our doing. Well, to some degree, it was our doing, Yeah. We wanted to be that way, and people wanted us out of the way over there, kind of thing. So,
but we stuck around. So there's another book you did that I'm interested in, came out COVID era, called Second Thoughts. Yeah. And I'm one of the ongoing themes of my book, and it's why I like interviewing people older than me instead of people who are in their 20s, is that sense of retrospection and the idea of looking back on one's life and the waves of history and how our perspectives change. So again, a book I haven't dived into yet, but tell me a little about Second Thoughts.
Well, it's a series of essays, first of all. And it was just, Second Thoughts means essentially at a certain age, looking back on your life is less ahead of you than there is behind you. And you're looking back, what did it all mean? What did it add up to? How did I become the person I became? Not, judgmental in any way, just historical. Yeah. Just how did this happen? What was I like? And so on. And so I started writing essays, and it coincided when I turned 80. My family had the idea, my daughter actually, I think, came up with the idea of going back to the Bronx where I grew up and visiting my old first apartment in the Bronx, the apartment I was raised in as a boy. And we ended up doing it. We got in touch with the people in the building and got to the woman who was living in the apartment now, a Dominican woman, Jewish then, Dominican now. That's New York. That's New York story. And we actually went. What is to say, I went, my wife went, my 2 children and their mates went. We all went up to the Bronx to this prearranged visit to go see my original apartment. And that's sort of what did it. I mean, I kept thinking there's more I should want to write about my parents, about my sister, about growing up, about, studying engineering when I should have been a journalist and all that kind of stuff. And so I did it, and there were various parts of it, and there was books I read. And, well, I'll give you a copy if you don't have one. And I'm glad I did it, but it is not anything. I didn't try to, sell it or anything or
so it was
find a commercial publisher. It was just self-published. But I'm glad I did it. But it was more for me and the people around me than anything else. If I were a famous person, people might be interested. If I were J.D. Salinger, people would lap it up. Oh, that's what he was like.
We may find out another year or two.
You're right. Well, so, I'm glad I did that. I'm glad. I spent my whole life as a magazine writer once I became a journalist. I really did. I was at essentially 2 magazines for the bulk of the time after the trade magazine, Newsweek and Businessweek, and an analytic form of journalism, weekly magazines in those days, And that's all I really wanted to be. So I felt that I realized my life's ambition, which took me a long time to realize and get started. But once I did, it was easy. Not easy, but I felt at home. I felt
natural.
Natural. Yeah.
This is where you needed to be. I should ask: did the study of engineering help? Not in terms of terminology and science, but in terms of breaking down what writing is.
Yeah, I mean, I've often thought about that. I don't have a great answer because look, I'm an analytic person to begin with, so. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? I mean, was I an analytic person and therefore studied engineering, or did engineering make me an analytic person? I think the engineering encouraged the analytic person in me, so I became more so. Maybe that's true. On the other hand, I became much more literary as I grew older, much more interested in literature and books and people like Salinger and the Jewish writers and so on, which is why I ended up writing about them. But I didn't write a book until my career was over.
I was going to ask, what was the
I stepped down from City University, the graduate school of journalism, in 2013. My first book I wrote in my last year there was a Deadlines and Disruption, My Turbulent Path from Print to Digital. It was a book about journalism written as a memoir. And the 3 other books, including the Salinger book, Jewish Writers book, Second Thoughts, all were in retirement. I did not have a paying job. I just did lots of things, but one of the things was I sat at my computer and wrote some books.
Do you wish you'd written them earlier, or was that simply the magazine and that form of writing was satisfactory?
Yeah, I couldn't have done it and been the editor of a weekly magazine. It just would have been impossible. I would have had to take a leave and so on. I mean, it didn't occur to me to do it. I never thought I would write a book.
Yeah, that's also what I wondered.
Yes, I never thought I would. And frankly, I wondered whether I could, whether I was capable of writing something longer like that. And as I came to view it as a series of magazine cover stories,
expanding into,
and I still think of it that way. So it's now called a book because it's 45,000 words or whatever.
Working on something else?
Oh boy!
Don't jinx it. No, you don't have to say. I know this just came out.
The short answer is no.
Okay.
The better answer is I don't know because I never thought I was going to write any of these books. So if you had asked me before I wrote this, I wouldn't have said I'm going to write a book about J.D. Salinger. I didn't know until whatever hit me. So I don't know the answer to that. But at my age, the chances are I'm not going to start in and do something because they do even.
Now, I will say, Jules Feiffer started doing full-length graphic novels in his mid-'80s because he was always doing strips and individual things, and 80-something years old,
let me ask you a question.
Pages is going to be my thing.
How long does it take to do a graphic?
It depends. I visited him to record, 2016 or 17, and he's drawing in a different style. He's not doing as fine as he may have done in some of his Village Voice strips and all that. But first, if you're doing it full time, you can make pages with some speed. But I know other guys, it's 11 or 12 years that they work on a single project because their day job and everything else. So yeah, it varies. If you're looking for someone to draw something for you, I can probably connect you. But that's a separate story.
I mean, I can imagine myself writing a magazine article, but I can't imagine myself writing another book at this stage of my life. Just because it takes too long.
Yeah.
You're talking.
Especially with the biographical and research.
Yeah, but this was mostly, it was easy in the sense that all I had to do was read a lot of material. I didn't go out and interview a lot of people. There's nobody around who
still
knew
had
the
to synthesize everything. You had to integrate and synthesize.
That's what I am. When I talk about analysis, it's an analysis and synthesis is what I do. This is a work of synthesis and a work of analysis. I didn't interview J.D. Salinger. Yeah. He's long dead, And I would have talked to his son, but he wouldn't talk to me. So, and there wasn't really anybody else to talk to. You just read what scholars have written and historians and biographies and so on, and then you put it all together and synthesize what interests you. And it came out the Religious Odyssey and the Young Women. That's
favorite Salinger
sex
story?
and religion. I mean,
that drives a lot of human history. So, a favorite Salinger story?
Well, it's not just a story, but the idea that he left Cornish, New Hampshire.
Well, I mean, favorite story that he published as opposed to favorite anecdote about him. But I realize that.
Oh, yeah, that's easy. Yeah, that's easy. You want to guess which one it is?
You go Banana Fish or Franny?
Dress Me with Love and Squalor,
right?
Which is in 9 stories.
Yeah.
I think a New York Times critic, I think it was Oliver Prescott, it's in the book, called Dress Me with Love and Squalor the best story to come out of the Second World War. Best short story, I guess he said. And it is a remarkable story. And I think it's one of the best stories, period. Best short stories, period. So I came away thinking, Banana Fish was very interesting, as some of the other stories are. And some of the older stories are quite interesting. But Dress Me with Love and Squalor is really in a class by itself. First of all, it is a war story. It is about a wounded soldier from the Second World War encountering a 13-year-old girl and her younger brother with orphan parents from the war. I mean, it just has it all, and it's so, so brilliantly done. So that's the one I will take with me forever.
Last question, which I always ask people, I should have emailed you, was coming. What are you reading?
Oh.
I figure you would know, so I didn't need to prepare.
Yeah, well, I belong to a book group. We have nine guys have been doing it for 12 years or something. And so I'm reading over the summer. We try to read a longer book because we don't meet. Normally we meet every month, so we don't read much over 300 pages. But this summer I've been rereading, actually, Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. Yeah. Because we picked this. It's a very long book. We picked it, but it's one of the great novels of all time. Yeah. And rereading it again is just such a pleasure. So that's what I'm reading, but it takes all summer.
No, I'm with you. That's it has one of my favorite lines of all of literature in it. I did a blog post many years ago about, I happened to get the good translation the first time, Ethel and Elmer Maude, back in the early 1900s.
Is this the first sentence?
Not the first sentence. It's the line when Levin sees Kitty for the first time, and I'm going to misquote it, unfortunately, but he saw her as one sees the sun looking away, but seeing her nonetheless, and it was just this.
That's great.
And I went to find every other translation of it. They're all disastrous. Every one of them.
So only one translator got it?
Everyone misses the poetry of that moment, and it was just like, well. At least the first time I read it, I happened to come across the perfect version of it.
I don't remember that, but when you said it.
I'll zap the post to you because it's pretty, it's interesting to see.
The famous line from that book is the first line.
Oh, sure.
Happy people are happy
families.
Yeah.
Which Nabokov throws on his axis later on. But anyway, I want to thank you for sitting down with me. B,
that's great. My God, we did a lot.
Oh, yeah. I tend to go long. I always tell people it's we have an hour or two, we'll have a good time. But this book is a wonder, and I really enjoyed
thank you.
Getting this, again, the religion and the sex, just getting all that tied together in the literary figure of Salinger like this. It's a fantastic achievement. And that was Stephen B. Shepard. Salinger's Soul is an illuminating book. It's a wonderful read, and if Steve's right and the unpublished work starts to come out in the next year or so, and I'm sorry for being so dismissive about it in the conversation, but it is more interesting, I guess, to me, that notion that maybe there's nothing in the vault, you know? But anyway, if all that stuff starts to come out in the next year or two, this is going to be a great primer for what we've got ahead of us. Now, Steve's not on social media, which we all know is for the best, but you should check out his site, StephenBShepard.com, all one word, to see more about his writing, interviews, appearances, and his thoughts on journalism over the years. And that's STEPHEN, the letter B, SHEPARD, StephenBShepard.com, all one word. Now you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast comes out every week with really interesting conversations with fascinating cultural folks. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie or TV show or book or piece of music, theater, art exhibition, whatever you think I should check out and turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me an email, by sending me a postcard or a letter. My mailing address is at the bottom of the newsletter I send out twice a week, which you should be subscribing to. Or you can use my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So you go longer than that, you'll just have to call back and leave a second message. And let me know if it'd be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to share with listeners, but I'd never run something like that without the speaker's permission. So let me know. Now, if you got money to spare, don't give it to me. I am going to ask you for money when I work on the Kickstarter for my book at the end of this year into next year. You'll find out more about that when it comes. But really, give to people and to institutions in need. With people, you can go through like GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, Crowdfunder. There are all sorts of crowdfunding platforms where you'll find people who need help making rent, medical bills, car payments, veterinary bills, getting an artistic project going. There are things people need, and maybe just a few dollars from you can make a real difference in their lives. So, please give. Now, with institutions, I give to my local food bank and World Central Kitchen every month. You can give to those sorts of things. You can give to election funds, freedom funds, Planned Parenthood, Women's Choice, trans protection, LGBTQIA funds and education. What I'm saying is there are a lot of things you can do to try to help build a better world. So, I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.